Right. So I'm going to open this up with a just a little bit of verse here out of Psalms 13, written by David. And just to make the point, like, understand that each of the Psalms was something that was sung in the temple in Jerusalem back in the day. Like, this was... They sang these songs the same way that we sang... Well, not the same way, but similar to the way that we sing hymns nowadays. Psalms 13 starts off, and we'll go verses 1 through 4. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemies triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. It needs to be acknowledged that this was sung as worship in the temple because it was real. And that no amount of righteousness or pretentiousness is ever going to create an actual relationship with God when we cannot acknowledge what's real. Every one of us comes across times and occurrences where we feel abandoned by God. The entire concept of abandonment is that point when you find yourself begging for help and finding no answers, receiving no answers. You sit there and you pray and you pray and you pray, and you're alone. Or at the very least, you feel alone. There is no person who escapes this. Nobody. I've heard people claim otherwise, and I've told them straight to their faces that they're liars. Because everybody runs across this at some point or another. If David ran across it, we will run across it. If Jesus himself faced this,
yeah, he did,
we will face this. I'm going to butcher some Aramaic really quick. No, I'm not. I started to try to read it. I'm like, I don't even know how to formulate the first. My God, why have you forsaken me? Does that ring a bell? It's out of Mark 15:34. Jesus crying this out to the heavens as he died on the cross. There was a moment where for the first time in existence, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit were separated. We talk about how the Trinity is a triune thing, like God is a triune being, and that the Trinity is an constant, unchanging community. Last week we talked about that, about how we're not built for rejection.
yeah,
In that moment, as Jesus was dying on the cross, God separated himself from himself.
wow,
And abandoned himself to death. So Jesus had to feel the full weight of abandonment in a way that he had never, ever had to experience. And in that moment, he was truly alone. Like, I can't, with my past and my experience, I cannot fathom the idea of what it would feel like to have been so close and to always have been so in so much proximity to another, and then to be cut off completely and to feel that loneliness.
Yeah.
I unfortunately have known loneliness very, very well in my life. So I can't even begin to comprehend what Jesus felt in that moment. But this happened. Jesus was abandoned on the cross as he died. And then it was done. And upon his death and resurrection, he was rejoined, as it were.
And so are we.
Yeah. This is something for us to consider, that even Jesus himself had to feel the weight of this loss of connection. And it bears explanation that, like, abandonment and rejection can often be very similar in, that breach of connection as it is. But they are different. Though oftentimes entwined, rejection specifically entails the breaking of connection by an action or a deed or a statement. Nobody who abandons you they usually don't tell you, yeah, get lost. Yeah, you're not good enough for me. Yeah, whatever. That's rejection. It has that little sting of somebody telling you that thing or hurting you in this way. Abandonment, you don't even get the sting. All you get is the nothingness, the emptiness. It's like when you get ghosted by your friends or whatever. Just cut off. Nobody talks to you. Nobody says anything. You just don't exist anymore. I've had friends and family. I've had friends who were disowned by their families. And the greatest pain that they had was that their family didn't even have the courtesy to tell them, I don't want you anymore. It was just, they treated them just like they didn't exist. I had friends who were part of the Jehovah's Witness community. And they left that church to join other churches, and they had the same thing happen where they were just cut out of the community completely. They would be walking through the store and they would see somebody from their old community, make eye contact with them and turn their backs and pretend as though they didn't exist. We had a girl here, actually, at this group for a little while, and she had the same experience. The Jehovah's Witness community is really big where she lives, and she spoke explicitly about having to live through that, being abandoned by the entire community as a result of her rejection of their views, their beliefs. And abandonment it runs deeper than that too. Like, a lot of us have had experiences where we've just been left to endure terrible things at the hands of parents, loved ones, churches, communities, friends, all kinds of family, where we've been faced with just the sorrow and the pain and the vacuum of not knowing, while we were just left to try to figure things out. Just left alone, carrying whatever thing was going to happen and having to face it alone. Feeling helpless, feeling powerless, feeling devoid of all hope of a future. Because who were we going to lean on when there was no one there? And the grim truth of it is that we have this experience with God. I don't think anybody right here, right now, I don't think anybody in our group at any point in time has ever not had moments where they reached out to God and were met with silence. Much like David in this psalm is met with silence as he as he writes it, speaks it, and prays this. And it becomes really difficult to sit with that, because everything that we hear, what is the nature of God? He's an omni-God, omnipresent, omnipotent. How can we be, why does it feel like we're being abandoned
When he's always present.
when he's always present? If we're saved, the Holy Spirit lives with us, right? Like, that's the whole thing that Jesus says. That Jesus says that he and God look at this person and say, we want to go live with them. And they do. They live right inside your heart. And yet, you find yourself in hard situations, and you find yourself feeling abandoned. What is that? Like, why is that? Why do we go through these periods where we're just left to feel this feeling of loneliness coming from a being who claims that we're his children, claims that he loves us, claims that he will always be there for us, claims that he will never abandon you? And yet here we are with that feeling. One of the hardest things for us as beings in this on this planet is trust. You ever have your parents like play a prank on you? Or they tell you something that's not true, and then they tease you about it when you believe them? I have. In fact, I've seen it happen a lot, where parents, as a joke, they tease their kids with this. They'll tell them something that's not true, and then when they go to believe it, they laugh about it. They think it's funny. Friends do it as well. Like, they'll do it all the time. Tell you something's true and then watch you go tell people about it.
Butt babies.
Butt babies.
I did that to Jeremy.
Yes. Well, you know, like, there are two types of babies.
Oh no.
There are the babies that come out normal, you know, from a woman, and then there are babies that come out of the butt. They're always ugly.
I was asking him which one it was he.
Oh
Yeah. This is an example. Like, this is a thing.
Why don't I feel bad?
It's fair. The
He
thing.
never believed me.
Well, no, he never believed you. The whole time he's like, "What is she talking about? That's not real. Everyone knows it's not real. I learned that in sophomore year of high school. There were pictures and everything." Well, the thing about it is that, like, all of these things, like, whether they, even though they're meant to be fun and they're meant to be a joke, especially when it's like your parents doing it to you when you're like 4, right? You can't
don't have the discernment to know
exactly.
what's real and what's not. You're like biologically designed to look to your parents for that.
Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
you look to the elders in your family as the sources of information and guidance and truth. And when they take advantage of that, it just kind of like rocks your whole world. It's why there's this kind of like constant joke about like Santa Claus being fake, and like parents telling their kids that, and how it creates mistrust in their kids later when they find out that it was always a lie. I do believe there was an entire episode of South Park about this, but that's a whole other topic. I mean, if they get it, come on.
Yeah.
The point is this, is that we're very much conditioned to not trust.
By the world.
Right. We are conditioned to not trust by circumstances, by the news, by friends, by family, by so many different things. And then that's galvanized by experiences. Experiences of being betrayed by people who we thought we were close to. You know, whether that's friends or loved ones or peers in any form of the word. We're told, don't trust people. And as a result, we have that in our head and we think to ourselves, okay, well, I shouldn't trust people. And then when we do decide to trust somebody and then they betray that trust, well, now that becomes galvanized. We say to ourselves, wow, that really hurt. I shouldn't have been trusting these people. I should never trust people. So as a result, it becomes, trust is something that we're very, very hard pressed to really put into anybody or anything. Even as a child, you approach some things, like after you've had those experiences, you'll approach things with caution. When you're a teenager, even more caution. Or sometimes it's not even caution so much as just blatant rebellion in some ways. You'll just crap all over it. And then as an adult, usually at that point you've had enough experiences now where this is just a fact. The fact is, don't trust people. The fact is, watch out for yourself. The fact is, the only person you can trust is you. These things become intrinsic values that we carry around. And abandonment particularly hurts. So what we learn to do is to always hold a part of ourselves back so that we never have to feel the deepest parts of pain from that action.
Yeah, we never want to feel that again, so we subconsciously or consciously,
yep,
do our best to make sure that it can't happen again because we don't believe people in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
Just like when we talked about rejection last week, it's a similar thing. You pull a part of yourself back and you reserve it for yourself in order to avoid having that pain. And part of that reservation is trust. So when God says something like, I will never abandon you, that part of you that's buried back there, and what's more is it's not just buried back there, but you're looking for reasons to not trust. You're looking for reasons to not believe. You're looking for reasons to expect that what you already hold true is going to be proven true again. How many times, when we look back on our experiences with God, and most of us are Christians sitting here listening to this, I mean everybody in the room, and then for those watching, it ends up being a similar situation. I can only think of a couple who would say they're not. But you have had periods where you have felt abandoned by God, and yet you are still a Christian. Why? Well, it's because something happened, right? Somehow, something happened where you were able to continue on being a Christian. It wasn't just because you said, well, God really hurt me. But this is what I'm accustomed to in my relationship, so I'm just going to continue on with this. No. Somewhere, something happened, right? Either that prayer was answered, finally, or he showed up in some way to remind you of who he is. In every instance where we have felt the pain of abandonment, God has eventually shown up and been there to rectify that situation. It may not have
shown you that he was there all along.
Right.
but you didn't see it.
Right.
Yeah.
And within that, he illustrated himself to be exactly who he says he is. It's why when we think about this, we remember the pain, but oftentimes the situations, sometimes they're easy to remember, but oftentimes when we think about it, we find that, oh yeah, this is actually resolved, or has resolved, or is being resolved right now. I think a lot about, like, the first year of Heather's, like, illness, and how many times I reached out to God and prayed and begged and prayed and begged for him to heal her, for him to stop it from happening, for him to reverse it, for all these different things. And now, in those moments, it was hopeless and felt very much so, and it was just suffering and brutality, and everything was wrong. And over time, what God did was he moved and brought in this new doctor, and brought in this means of help, and brought in this piece of knowledge, and brought all these different things together for us to be able to move forward. See, the difficult thing about abandonment, and this isn't to say that it's our fault or anything like that, but what it is that due to that preconditioning and that tendency towards not trusting, the way that we're taught to not trust at any point in time, to protect ourselves from trust, is that God is not excluded from that particular collection of values that we maintain. God's just another being. God's just another entity that runs through that filter. Whether we want to pretend, like a lot of us like to pretend that that's not true, but it is true. Because unfortunately, the way that we work as human beings, as creatures, is that we are not as complex as we like to believe. We will use the same kinds of mentalities to approach different forms of beings as we would each other. It's why people will treat their dogs like other people. We don't actually differentiate as much as we like to claim we do. It's why when you have people who are abusive to their dogs, they're often abusive to other people. They might not act out on it, but when you see them acting it out on their dog, that's because it tells you exactly what you need to know about that person and who they really are underneath all that. With God, it's the same kind of problem. We approach God with the same caution, the same lack of trust, because in the end, we are very much, especially in Western society, taught to base as much as we can off of evidence. Even some of my training in the prophetic. Do you know how you know if a word is true or not? Does it happen? At the time, like, that seems like a very reasonable approach. But it's not. Like, in the end, with a lot of prophecy, there are choices involved. Even when you look at, like, the books of the prophets, when God is like Hosea, for example, when God is just drilling into Israel and then saying, if you turn back to me, I will reverse all of this. I will provide us with this new place. I will create a new, a new relationship and a new life for us together. God, in those prophets were prophesying what God was saying, but there was a choice that the Israelites had to make, and they did not make that. So instead, they got all the other bad stuff. In that same vein, this searching for evidence can at times mislead us misdirect us. See, trust typically is in character. We all understand that trust is something that has to be earned, right? But that's not necessarily true. Like, the truth of trust is that trust is given. It's just that usually we put on the caveat of trust is earned, which means we give that trust after they have proven that they are trustworthy. Mm-hmm. We don't remove that from God. Like, many of us approach God the same way, where we look for reasons to see if he is going to actually be somebody who we can trust. And when he doesn't meet our quotas, when his actions do not align with our judgments for when and how he should act, then we write him off as being untrustworthy. And in that way, unintentionally, we create our own story of abandonment.
Oh, wow. When it's not really what's happening.
Right. Because God's nature does not change. He's not less omnipotent or omnipresent because of reasons. He is always that. He is always there. If you have the Holy Spirit, he is always with you. That doesn't change. And if he's silent in your pain and misery, that's not because of you. And it's not because he's ignoring you. There's lots of reasons for God to be silent when we are in the worst of our pain and suffering. To tell you the truth, and something that he actually did point out to me many times, is that sometimes we can't even hear him in our pain and misery. We're so busy wailing and gnashing our own teeth that we can't even hear him when he talks. He could tell us directly that I'm here, and we can't hear it because we're so caught up in whatever's happening, or we dismiss it, or we ignore it, or we turn on him for it. He speaks up, and then we turn and attack him. And then we feel abandoned because he's not talking anymore after we've attacked him. These are things that happen as people suffer in the presence of God. And he will wait. And that's the thing about him, is he doesn't leave. He waits. That's a part of his character. It's a part of his nature.
That's good.
The problem with that for us is that we can misjudge his nature and his waiting as abandonment. So we will judge this and say, he's not even here for me. He's silent right now when I need somebody right now. And we're not wrong to say that we need somebody right now, because we do. Like, in the midst of those worst times and the sufferings that we go through and the pains that this world can offer us, we need somebody. And ideally, it's God. But we're not always safe for everybody else. Sometimes we're the toxic one. Sometimes all that pain and anguish creates a toxic environment inside of our own hearts, where we actually become the person who cannot be touched because we're radioactive. The moment anybody touches us in the wrong way, we're going to go nuclear. And touch is a relative term. It could mean simply even saying the wrong thing. I have had that so many times where I've spoken to people who were in the worst state of things, and I tried to offer a helping hand and got torn down to pieces because they weren't ready. They weren't ready to receive a helping hand or a pat on the back. They needed time to go cool off. Just as much as I have been that person to God or to others at times, when all they did was they tried to reach out to me and I lashed out toxically. See, the thing about pain and anger is that it can create bitterness and resentment. And when you're resentful and bitter, that is poisonous to you and to the people around you. And the truth of the matter is that sometimes desperation can be just as toxic. It can make us move in ways where we do things that are we would deem unspeakable at any other point in time. It can make us move outside of our very own character. Mm-hmm. We will diminish ourselves to not feel the pain or the agony. We will do things that God himself would never okay, because we want to mitigate our own suffering. And especially if we feel abandoned by him, then why would we stop when this is going to make us feel better? Hopefully, maybe, but we have to try something to make it stop. Desperation is just as dangerous and just as capable of blinding us. And these are examples of things that lead us into that place of feeling abandoned by God. Because unless, in the instance of Jesus, his purpose behind the abandonment of Jesus on the cross was because he had to. In order for Jesus to truly die for our sins, God had to separate himself from Christ in order for Christ to truly carry the weight of sin and to have it and to be crucified for real.
And it was so that we could be together forever.
Right. There aren't a lot of points where we go through things, and sometimes there is a story there's an overarching perspective, but it doesn't necessarily mean abandonment. Sometimes we go through things that are very difficult. Sometimes it's the weight of our choices that we didn't foresee. One example that comes to mind is my dad. I can't remember if I told this story or not. I think I told it last week about rejection, but I don't remember. But it's a little foggy. But the thing with my dad was that at one point he wanted to get back together with my mom. Back when I was in like first grade. Or second grade, technically. And, he felt like he wanted to go about it this way. He wanted to get back together with her, and he really felt like there was a chance. And he prayed about it and asked God, should I go? And he said,
you go and talk to her.
Yep, to go talk to her. And God said, you can if you want. And he did. He drove out there at midnight. Like he sent her I think he called her and to see if she was up, and then drove out there and they talked, and he found out that she was not interested in getting back together. There was zero desire on her behalf to bring that family back together. And in that moment, like, he just found himself sitting there thinking to himself, wow, like, why did God allow me to go do this? But later on, he had to consider, would he have listened if God said no? And weighing it, no, he would have found a reason for why he should go. And as a result, because he really wanted it and didn't understand like how past it my mom was, he was always going to have to run into that wall in order to really be able to accept that this isn't here anymore. This door is closed. We run into those kinds of things all the time. Like, as much as we like to perceive or contrive the idea that, we're capable of just being told that the pot is hot and to not touch it, that's not always true. There are some things that we want so very, very bad and that are so very dangerous for us, but we can't hear it. We have to experience
We
it.
have to find out.
And we find ourselves, and oftentimes in those instances, we can again feel abandoned by God. Why did you allow this to happen? From his perspective, he allows it to happen because we weren't going to learn any other way. And as he's grooming us for a life of eternity with him, those kinds of things can be very, very problematic. So by our judgments, we judge this as being an action that where God just left us to endure this thing. But in reality, what other option was he going to have? We weren't going to listen, so the best he can do is just be there with us through it, right? But oftentimes when we're going through those particular things, we don't lean on him, we don't go to him, we don't seek him out, we just want what we want. This happens. So it was never that God abandoned us, we just made a choice that was outside of the path that he was leading us onto, or that he was trying to carry us through to. Like, there are many instances where we remove ourselves from God and then get upset at him for abandoning us, when in reality it's us who step off the path. This happens a lot. The reality of relationship with Jesus, with God, is that it is what it is. Like, it is more complicated than we like to believe. We like to dumb everything down to it simply being like, look, just follow whatever God wants. Well, what happens when you have something that you want so badly that you can't quite hear God because you're so loud in your own head? Or maybe there's a temptation there and the enemy is so much louder and you like that sound of that better because it's more in line with your heart and what you want than what God's telling you. Well, it sounds good, so you're going to go with it. Sometimes. We oftentimes create our own circumstances of abandonment. Whether it is based on our conditioning to believe certain things or act certain ways that the world has offered us, or because of our desires that where we would separate ourselves from God in order to have them. At neither of those points are we abandoned.
Yeah.
But at both of those points we can easily feel that way. And sometimes things are just incredibly hard. And it's not your fault. It's not because you were conditioned to be that way. It's not because of anything. It's just because things are very, very, very hard. And this world is not a place that God controls. You know, one thing that's needs to be made very clear is that God does not control every storm. He does not control every weather front. He doesn't control every tsunami. There are instances in Scripture where he sends a storm or does something like that, but do you think that there weren't other storms happening in the world? Do you think that God specifically was like, okay, I got to send a storm over here and a storm over there and a storm over there? He's not sitting there controlling every aspect, every weather front. The wind moves in circles and cycles. There are air currents that are constantly flowing in their own way, and then they fluctuate, and then they stick to that pattern for a while. Things that we've learned through science are that, you know, it pulls away the idea that God is directly controlling everything. To say that God is in control is not to say that he is forcing everything to happen, At any point, God can change the currents of the wind. At any point, God can remove that storm or send that storm. But that doesn't mean that it's always him. It doesn't mean that every single one has his fingerprints on it.
Yeah, he doesn't make his will happen.
Well, sometimes.
Sometimes, but he leaves things up to choice.
Right. Which is to the point here, which is that there are some things that are left that are beyond choice, that are beyond whatever. They're just circumstantial. And as a result, something bad happens and it becomes really hard, and we find ourselves having to survive it. And that's not God punishing us, it's not God being mean, it's not God doing anything, it's just the situation. The weather goes out, or the weather comes in really cold, you get a freeze snap, and then the heater dies. That wasn't because God was punishing you in some way. It wasn't God abandoning you and leaving you to the cold.
He's not always saying something underhanded.
Exactly. Which is an important thing for us to grasp, because we do that.
He's not passive-aggressive.
We spiritualize way too many things as Christians. And as a result, it creates this false idea of God's character that we can now turn around and be afraid that he's looking for ways to hurt us when we might be being bad. We might not even have done anything bad, but suddenly we find ourselves searching desperately for that one thing that we did. It creates a bad relationship. It's just like when, I think it was 2012, when we had several pink moons, and all the prophets everywhere were talking about the end times, and this was the year, and you know, the meaning of those many pink moons, and none of it happened. Not a single thing happened with it, because it was purely just some pink moons. It was a weird happenstance, it was interesting, it was kind of cool, but it had no spiritual value. At least not to to Christianity at large, as much as we wanted it to. Like when the year 2000 came around and everybody assumed that was the end, and we applied significance to this and presumed that it was the time, and then nothing happened. We, in this kind of frame of thought, we create a version of God that is not God. We've taken a few stories of instances and things that he did, and then applied that much more broadly to create a character who is less like Jehovah, less like Yahweh, and a lot more like Zeus. And this is a problem that we have to be able to get past, and the process for getting past that goes back to what we started with in talking about trust. We need to be able to trust who God is, and that he's going to be who he is. To finish that Psalm of David, we'll start back at verse 3. Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, and my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. Verse 5. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. whatever David was feeling when he wrote this, he knew God. And he knew to trust in God's character and his person. Because he knew that God is every bit of who he says he is. And even though it's hard at times, even though all the evidence can seem like it's pointing to something opposite, we need to understand and remember that evidence can be tampered with, and more than that, evidence comes through the filter of our own perception.
Yeah.
And we're trained, even though we're trained to trust that very, very much, we also need to start accepting that we have way too much trust in ourselves and way too little trust in a being that created us.
We trust our perceptions.
In psychology, one of the first lessons you learn about, like this is like Psych 101, is that you learn about the issue with human perception. Perception, memory, and there's one other thing, but I can't remember what it is. But the reason why these things matter is when you're sitting there talking to somebody about the things that happened in their lifetime. These two filters in particular can very much throw off everything about it. It's why when you have 5 different people who experience an event, you can ask them for written testimonies and you'll find that their memories of the event are not completely different, but have significantly different details.
Yeah.
Because the details that mattered to this person and really stood out didn't matter so much to this other person because they were focused on this other detail.
Yeah.
And as human beings, we do have this inclination towards different things. You might remember the feeling of an experience with God more than what happened in that experience. You might be able to tell somebody, like, I had this experience with God and it felt incredible. I felt so much joy and love, and I've never felt so much love and compassion in my heart. It's like, well, what happened? I was praying and God revealed this thing to me, but I felt so much off of it. Just like in the opposite way, you can have somebody who just gets caught up in this incredibly rapturous revelation and says, oh my gosh, this is what God told me, and somebody else is like, well, what did that make you feel? I felt included, I guess. And I'm giving like dramatized versions, but it's just to make the point that our extremes can be various. And the things that matter to us can differ greatly. As a result, our perceptions can be problematic at times, and our memories can be even more problematic. But in this is where we have to be able to take and trust God at His word, that He is who He says He is, and to lean on that. And the thing about that is that you will find evidence again and again and again where He reveals Himself to be everything that He says He is. Just like He did to Moses, when Moses led the Israelites to the desert, and even Moses had moments of questioning. And yet God continued to show up and be who He was, who He is. He showed up to Moses and showed his back to him and told him who he was, and then they continued. When the Israelites grumbled, God sent manna from heaven. When they grumbled about the lack of meat, He sent quail. When they were getting bit to death by snakes, He provided them a means to be healed of snake bites. He led them personally through the desert by day and by night as a pillar of cloud in the day and a pillar of fire at night. When they begged for water, He told Moses to hit a rock with a stick, and water came out of that rock. all that to say, in that one instance, Moses even doubted for a moment when he slept that rock and nothing happened at first. So he slapped it again. That was him showing a lack of trust. In the face of everything that happened, he still had that moment. And it's something to understand for all of us, is that where we face abandonment is where the nature of God clashes with our perception, our judgments, our feelings. Because he will never abandon you. He just may not show up exactly when you want him to. He won't work on your timelines. And sometimes if we're all honest about it, that doesn't work for us. And we find ourselves creating judgments, creating ideas about him, about his character, about what we should expect from him, about how we have to protect ourselves from him. And therein lies the crux of our problem with abandonment. There's a head game going on that we're being played into, and then that we're playing. And just to clarify one thing with this, I never want to exclude the enemy and his machinations from these kinds of topics, because it's not just all about you. There's absolutely another force at play that's popping in here and being like, yeah, this is why you can't trust God. Yeah, God has abandoned you. Look, you were crying and everything, and he didn't, and he chose to ignore you.
He's constantly accusing God.
Constantly accusing God. And that's something that we have to be cognizant of. Again, that's why we need to trust in his character at his word more than trust in our perception of his character. Because there are other words being thrown at us. And there are other presentations of his character being thrown at us. And as much as people like to say that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing everybody that he doesn't exist, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing everybody that God was evil. And that is one that he continues to press. And there are lots of people who believe it. Again, it's why so many people look at God more as a Zeus than a Yahweh. And even in the Bible, even when we read the Bible and read the stories around Jesus, Jesus came manifesting the character of God, and nobody recognized him. The Jews, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they met somebody living, breathing, and speaking as the one that they worshipped, and couldn't recognize him for who he was. Because their version of God was different. So, this is a thing for us to meditate on, to carry around, and to be aware of.
Yes.
But it's also something for us to pray into, where we relinquish our judgments about God and we ask him to make himself known to us. Not purely through action, but also through experience, through his effect on our hearts and our minds and our lives in general, to remind us of who he actually is when we start forgetting. Because in the end, we need him. And it makes it really hard for us to accept that need when we don't trust him.
And so we avoid it in our consciousness.
Yes. And that's what I've got.